In this quarter and probably the entire month of June, we're going to focus on Matthew 1:1 to 4:17. And then next year, Lord willing, in the same quarter, we'll then do Matthew 4:17 to chapter 7:29 in the Sermon on the Mount. And then the following year, Lord willing, we would do the next section. That's my plan. And it's just the solution I chose because I really want to dive deep into this text in a way that just draws out its richness so I can share the things that you can see when you do a study like that. Now, I also had to consider, how are we going to look at each individual portion of text? If you go to page 3 of your book, or I'm sorry, it's the very first page, not page 3, I'm sorry. If you just open up the cover, the very first page, you will see how we're going to approach the text in Matthew. We're going to be going over it from several angles. First, we're going to examine the big picture. What are the big picture points that Matthew is trying to get across in this portion of text that we're examining each Sunday? We want to see the forest before we look at individual trees. Once we've done that, then we are going to focus on some important details, things that add richness and nuance to the big picture message that Matthew is communicating. And then we're also going to point out some literary features. If you were in my class last year called The Four Gospels, a narrative approach to their interpretation, hopefully you remember the big point that I was getting across in that class, which is that the Gospels are narratives. That's the form of literature that the Holy Spirit has used to communicate Jesus to us in those compositions that we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And because they are written as narratives, the authors use literary techniques to help communicate meaning to us. And we're going to note some of those things that Matthew does in the telling of his narrative. We're going to note those things as we move through the text. Let me say one thing here for the benefit of Robert Klaus and anyone else who may be watching this who struggles with this. Robert missed the class in last year's class that I did where I spoke about the word story. So let me say this briefly so that nobody misunderstands. You are going to hear me refer to Matthew's gospel as a story, as a narrative. And it is very important to remember that that word is not synonymous with fiction. Story does not mean fiction. The same way that if we were to say, oh, the Psalms are poetry, well, that doesn't mean, therefore they're fiction. They're imaginative. Well, they're imaginative in that they evoke imagery, but poetry is the form of literature the Holy Spirit used to communicate truths to us about God or about whatever it is the psalmist was speaking about. The same thing here. So when I mention Matthew being a story or a narrative, I'm merely referring to the genre that Matthew is using by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to tell us about Jesus. It in no way is commenting on the historicity of what we're talking about. Matthew's writing about true things. It's not fiction, but he is telling us those things, those truths in the form of a narrative. And so that's very important. We'll see that as we go throughout. And then we're also going to approach the text by looking at Matthew's use of the Old Testament and his Christology. That is, what claims is he making about Jesus' person, his ministry, who he is, what he's doing. Matthew's use of the Old Testament is a major element of his gospel. And so I want us to dive into that and look at how is he using the Old Testament and how is he showing how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament scriptures. We're going to do that. And then finally, all throughout our class, we'll be making applications for what Matthew is saying. Now, here's the test portion that Mr. Jim, I was joking with Mr. Jim, he said, is there going to be a test? Well, no, but I do want you to see how much you learn in this class. And to do that, we need to first see what you already know. So would you look at page 3 of your book? Page 3 of your book. There are some questions there to ask you what you already know. Now, before you get started, don't start yet, because I'm going to give you some time to answer each one. These questions are not meant to shame you. If you are having trouble answering these questions, that's okay. Just put, I don't know. If you don't know an answer to one of these questions, just put I don't know. Because at the end of this class in June, we're going to go back to those questions, and if I've done my job, you should have much more to put for your answers, and it's going to show you how much you learned in this class on Matthew's Gospel. So let me give you a chance to answer them now. I'm going to give you 30 to 45 seconds just to jot down whatever your current knowledge is of Matthew's Gospel based on these questions. Here's the first question. What are major themes that Matthew develops in his Gospel narrative? Take 30, 45 seconds to put down. What are the themes that you know that Matthew develops in his Gospel narrative? If you don't know, just put I don't know. Again, there's no shame here. Let's just see what you already know. And if anyone still needs a pen, who maybe came in after, just raise their hand. I have pens to give out if anyone needs a pen. Need a book? Gotcha. No, that's all right. That's all right. Does anyone else need a book? Maybe someone who came in after? All right, let's go to the second question. What specific claims about Jesus does Matthew make in 1:1 to 4:17? So in just that first opening section of Matthew 1:1 to 4:17, what specific claims about Jesus does Matthew make in that portion? Just put whatever you currently know. Question 3 is this. I may need to explain this. I'm not thrilled with how I worded this question, but how does Matthew connect Jesus to the larger biblical story contained in the Old Testament? In other words, what are some connections that Matthew makes between Jesus and the Old Testament? And so you can write down those connections that you know Matthew makes. Another thing that you could use for or answer for this question is, what are the techniques Matthew uses to connect Jesus to the Old Testament? Again, that may not be super clear to you, but just put whatever you know or what you think. And again, it's okay to put I don't know if you don't know anything. And then finally, number 4. What does the phrase kingdom of heaven mean in Matthew's gospel? What does the phrase kingdom of heaven mean in Matthew's gospel? Just put what you already know there. Or even just your guess, even if you're just guessing. As you're wrapping those up, again, these questions are not meant to shame you. It's just to give us or give you a knowledge of where am I currently at in my knowledge of Matthew's gospel. Because again, at the end of June, in our very last class of this portion of Matthew, I'm going to have you at the end of your book answer the exact same questions. And again, if I've done my job, you should have much more to write down when you're answering those questions. Now, these questions tie into what our objectives are for this class. Let me put them up here very quickly because you'll see me refer to these throughout. At the end of this class, if I've done my job, you will be able to explain Matthew's major themes that he introduces in Matthew 1:1 to 4:17, which is his prologue. The reason I've done Matthew 1:1 to 4:17, I failed to mention this earlier, is because that's very clearly what we might call a prologue or an introduction to his gospel. And so you're going to be able to explain major themes that he introduces in that opening of his narrative. You're also going to be able to describe Matthew's claims about Jesus. What are those things that specifically that Matthew is claiming about this man from Nazareth that he claims in this opening prologue of his gospel? You'll also be able to interpret Matthew's narrative in light of the larger biblical narrative. In other words, I want you to be able to see the connections between the story that Matthew is telling and the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament, because Matthew is constantly going to refer us back to those Old Testament Scriptures, since they're a primary lens through which he wants us to see Jesus. And so you're going to be able to do that and give some examples of that at the end of this class. Fourth, you'll be able to explain what Matthew, what John the Baptist, and what Jesus mean by the phrase kingdom of heaven. And then fifth and finally, you'll be able to give some examples of how to apply Matthew's gospel to your discipleship. Those are the objectives we have for this class. You'll see me refer to them throughout. Before we get started in today's material, let me briefly just give a few thank yous. I would feel like I was doing a disservice to some people if I didn't thank them for making this class possible. I want to thank the elders for being willing to print these books. I do these books for all my classes, and it's only because the elders are willing to do it. I also want to thank Allison Ham for two reasons. She found a way for us to print and bind these in-house instead of going to ProCopy like we used to do, and it has saved us a ton of money. So thank you to Allison for that, and then also thank you to Allison because she printed out all the pages of these books and helped to bind them. I want to thank Mike Ham. If you're a fan of that clear cover on the front of your book, you have Mike Ham to thank for that because he, on his own volition, individually hole punched every single one of those clear covers so we could have that clear cover on the front of the book. So I want to thank Mike Ham for doing that. And then finally, at the risk of embarrassing her, I need to thank my wife, who's now ceased making eye contact with me as I said that to him. Putting a class like this together obviously takes a lot of time on my part, and that's time that I'm not spending with my wife, Natalie. And if it were not for her willingness to sacrifice some of that time for me to put as much effort and as much rigor into these classes that I want, if she wasn't willing to make that sacrifice, my classes would not be what I want them to be. And so she deserves thanks for sacrificing time with my wonderful self for making these classes possible. Although probably there's times where she's very glad that I'm in my office and not spending time with her when she gets annoyed with me. That's right. There you go. There's Cornell right there. Very good. Very good. Also, just for my own sanity, if you look at the last page of your book, you don't have to go there, but it should say page 64. I didn't realize until after we printed them all out that the keystroke of the 4 didn't take. So it just says page 6, and that bugs me to death that I missed that. So I got to mention it. It's supposed to be page 64. That's just my OCD. I had to get that out just to acknowledge that. All right, let's get into our material today. Oh, very good. Yeah, Craig fixed it. He wrote the 4 in his book. There you go. I want to take our remaining minutes today to set the stage for Matthew's gospel, and here's why. Would you turn to Matthew 1, verse 1? Go to Matthew 1:1. Because this verse, this opening line of Matthew's gospel is why we're going to do what we're going to do in today's remaining minutes. So go to Matthew 1:1. This opening line, there's a lot we could discuss just from this line in Matthew's gospel, but and we're going to do that next week. But I want to focus on one particular thing that Matthew is revealing to us by opening his gospel the way he does. Matthew's opening line is this: the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And among other things, what that opening line is revealing to us is that the story Matthew is about to tell us is not a story told in isolation. He is writing the continuation of the story of the Old Testament, the story of Israel, the Hebrew Scriptures. In fact, as you read Matthew's gospel, you'll see Matthew isn't just writing a continuation of that story. He's claiming that this man from Nazareth is the climax to that story of Israel and what God has been doing since creation. So if we read Matthew's gospel divorced, in isolation from the Old Testament, we are going to read Matthew against the grain, so to speak, and we are going to miss so many of the richness and the truths that Matthew is telling us in this narrative. So that's why what I want to do today is I want to look at a few key background texts that will set the stage for us for Matthew's gospel so that we can understand his story in its context. So the first passage we're going to look at is Isaiah 40. Isaiah 40. Go ahead and turn there. And these are on page 4 of your book. If you go to page 4 of your book, you'll see these passages and some blanks there to fill out. We're going to start with Isaiah 40 because this passage gives us a very important background to the word gospel, good news. We call this book that we're going to study this quarter the Gospel according to Matthew. Well, Matthew didn't make up that word gospel. That has a history, not only in its Greco-Roman context, but also from the Old Testament itself, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And Isaiah 40 is a very important background to this idea of what is the good news. So let's look at it together. And as we read Isaiah 40, I want you to think about this question. It's in your book, but it's here on the screen. What is the good news? According to Isaiah 40, verses 9 to 11, what is the good news? So think about that as we read it. Here we go. Isaiah 40, verses 9 through 11. Go on up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good news. Lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord Yahweh comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom, and gently lead those that are with young. Now, I've designed this class, there's going to be times where I'm going to ask a question and I want your thoughts. I want you to contribute things. For today, because I'm a little crunched on time, I won't do that at every question. So some of these are just meant to get you reflecting just kind of on your own there in your seat. But I promise in the future, I do want to hear from you. I'm going to ask questions and I want to get your thoughts. But as we consider this passage, it's important that we understand what the good news is that Isaiah 40 is talking about. The good news is that Yahweh is coming to his people. Do you see that in Isaiah 40? That's the good news. It's what's revealed in verse 9. O Jerusalem, herald of good news, lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord Yahweh comes with might, and his arm rules for him. The good news of Isaiah 40, the gospel of Isaiah 40, is that Yahweh is coming to his people and he's coming to his people to rule. That's the next blank there in your book. He is coming to his people to rule as king. You see that in verse 9, or excuse me, in verse 10. His arm rules for him. The good news, the gospel of Isaiah 40 is that Yahweh is coming to reign as king. And what that means is that he is going to reward his people and right wrongs. That's what his kingship means. To reward his people and right wrongs. Do you see that also in verse 10? Look again at verse 10 with me of Isaiah 40. Behold, the Lord Yahweh comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. And recompense being, he's going to right wrongs. He's going to restore what's been lost. And by the way, I forgot to say this earlier. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. So if you're using an electronic Bible and it's just easier for you to read the same translation I'm reading from, just know that. I'm reading from the ESV, the English Standard Version. So Yahweh, the good news is that Yahweh is coming to his people to rule as king, which means he's going to reward his people and he's going to right wrongs. And then finally, one more thing we'll mention here, he's going to personally care for his people. That's also what God's kingship means. He's going to personally care for his people, and you can see that in verse 11 of Isaiah 40. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He's a shepherd king. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. God's kingship means care for his people. Personal care for his people. So just to sum up, an important background for this word gospel that Matthew uses in his gospel narrative. He uses the word gospel. Where does he get that word from? Well, it's from passages like this in Isaiah. And the good news of Isaiah, and really of the whole Old Testament, is that God will come to reign as king. That is what Isaiah 40 is all about. And if you look in your book, you'll see another passage there from Isaiah, Isaiah 52, verse 7, or I think I put 7 to 10. That's a parallel passage. We're not going to look at it, but on your own time, if you look at that, that is another passage that talks about the gospel, and the gospel is that Yahweh reigns as king. Now, real quick, just to clarify, obviously God has always been king. He's king right now over creation. He's the creator. But the Old Testament scriptures recognize something that you recognize when you look out into the world. We can say wholeheartedly and truthfully that Yahweh is king. But we can see in creation that his kingship is not manifested universally. There's rebellion in creation. There are things that are not the way the king wants them to be. And so what Isaiah is talking about throughout his entire book is that when Yahweh comes as king, he's going to right all those wrongs. He's going to reward those that have been faithful to him. He's going to judge those that rebelled against his kingship. And he's going to restore the things in creation that have been marred and corrupted by sin. That's the good news of Isaiah. And that's an important concept to understand because Matthew will draw on that in his own narrative of Jesus. Let me do one more, and then I want to stop and see what questions you have, just for time's sake. Let me get through the second one. So if you have a question, don't feel free to write it down just so you don't forget. I don't want you to forget it, but let me do this next one, especially because these are connected. Keep in mind what we've just seen in Isaiah 40 about the good news being God's kingship, his reign coming to earth. Now let's look at Ezekiel 37. Flip over there to Ezekiel 37. Ezekiel lives after the time of Isaiah, but yet makes a lot of parallel points. But there's a particular nuance to this passage that I want us to consider. There's much that I'd love to discuss in Ezekiel 37. We don't have time. We're just going to notice a couple things. That's it. But as we read Isaiah 37, verses 23 to 26, I want you to think of this question. Keep this question in mind. What is God promising in this passage? What is God promising? Now we're jumping into, in verse 23, we're jumping into the middle of a train of thought. So just know that we're jumping into a passage where God is describing how He's going to restore His people of Israel. So just keep that in mind. And so now let's jump into verse 23 of Ezekiel 37. They, that is His people Israel, they shall not defile themselves anymore with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions, but I will save them from all the backslidings in which they have sinned, and I will cleanse them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever, and David my servant shall be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant. And I will set them in their land and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in their midst forevermore. Now, what is God promising in this passage? Well, there's a lot of things He's promising. I just want to highlight two. Actually, I've cheated because the first point is really two things that I put in here. One thing that God's promising is He's promising relationship and new covenant to His people. Relationship and new covenant. That's one thing, or if you're going to get technical, I guess you could say two things, although these are integrally connected. You see that in verses 23. Let's just look at 23 again, real quick. Look at Ezekiel 37, verse 23, and notice the new relationship that He's promising and what it entails. They, that is the people of Israel, shall not defile themselves anymore with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions, but I will save them from all the backslidings in which they have sinned, and will cleanse them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. New relationship. Notice that in verse 23, that new relationship includes saving His people from their sins. Do you remember what we are told in Matthew 1 about why Jesus is given the name Jesus? Notice the connection here. Matthew 1, verse 21 on the screen. She will bear a son, and you shall call His name Jesus, which means Yahweh saves, for He will save His people from their sins. With that Ezekiel 37 passage in your mind, do you see what Matthew is saying about this child? God had promised to the prophet Ezekiel to save His people from their sins, and Matthew is telling us something extraordinary, that God is going to do that through this child. This child is going to be the means by which God accomplishes what He promised in Ezekiel 37. I will save my people from their sins. And He's going to do it through this Nazarene. And you notice also in verse 26 of Ezekiel 37, God promises new covenant. I will establish a covenant of peace with them, an everlasting covenant. Can you think of where the idea of covenant comes into play in Matthew's story, Matthew's gospel? You remember where? Remember in Matthew 26, when Jesus says these words, and He took a cup, and when He had given thanks, He gave it to them and said, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Here is the new covenant that God had promised back in Ezekiel 37. And notice that in this passage in Matthew, new covenant is coupled with forgiveness of sins, just like it is in Ezekiel 37. I will establish a new covenant with them. And in verse 23, we saw it includes, I'm going to save my people from their sins. And yet what we're told in Matthew, again, extraordinary, and not the way we would have told the story, is that God is going to do it by having his king killed by the Romans. That's how God's going to accomplish new covenant, saving his people from their sins. What God had promised to do in Ezekiel 37, he's doing in this man, Jesus of Nazareth. But then one more thing in Ezekiel 37. Notice that God also promises a Davidic king in Ezekiel 37. You see that in verse 24. Ezekiel 37:24, where God says, "My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall have one shepherd." And then later again in verse 25, "David my servant shall be their prince forever." In other words, what God is making clear here is that, you remember in Isaiah 40, the good news was that God's kingship is coming to earth. He's coming to reign as king. But what Ezekiel 37 makes clear, as does Isaiah, by the way, Isaiah makes the same point. But what Ezekiel 37 makes clear is that God's kingship is going to go through the instrument of the Davidic dynasty. He's going to rule as king through a son of David. It is the Davidic throne through which Yahweh's kingship will be exercised in creation. And you've already seen how Matthew starts his gospel with this line. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. You see what Matthew is claiming in this opening line of his gospel? That the Davidic king that God had promised in passages like Ezekiel 37, I'm about to tell you the story of that Davidic king. It's a man named Jesus from the town of Nazareth. God is doing what he promised. Now, let me stop here. Again, we're looking at these passages to set the stage for Matthew's gospel so we can see his story in the context of the previous part of the story, which is the Old Testament. Because Matthew is writing a continuation in the climax of the Old Testament. What questions or thoughts do you have on anything from Isaiah 40 or Ezekiel 37 and how they form a backdrop for the story that Matthew is going to tell us? What questions or thoughts do you have? Yeah, Ken? What's the time span between Ezekiel and Jesus? We're just going to use round figures here, but Isaiah and Ezekiel would have been, I guess Isaiah's earlier. So for Isaiah, probably around, hang on, you're asking me to remember the dates, 8th century, 7th century. So Isaiah lived about 700 years before Jesus. Ezekiel would have lived, if I'm remembering correctly, Ezekiel would have lived maybe 500 to 600. I got to look up the Ezekiel time frame because it's escaping me now for sure, but around there. It's in that ballpark. Several hundred years before Jesus comes on the scene. Ken just stumped me. Oh, no, he's got another question. He's throwing at me. Yes. Yes. Ken just made a great point that this shows us the time frame of God is so different from what we would expect or want it to be. We would expect God to, hey, let's do this quickly. Come on, God, let's get this going. And it's hundreds of years. In fact, think of how long they were in Egypt. Like, you promised to give us this land, and it's 400 years. We're in Egypt in slavery. What's your timetable here, God? Well, it's not ours. That's for sure. So that's a very important point. Very good. Any other questions or thoughts on Isaiah 40 or Ezekiel 37 and their backdrop, how they form a backdrop to Matthew's gospel? Well, let's look at the third passage I want to look at as a backdrop to Matthew's gospel. Very, very important background text. Really, it's the whole book of Daniel, really, is an important background book to Matthew. But go to Daniel 2. We're going to look at two passages in Daniel because they're connected and they're both so important for understanding Matthew's gospel. By the way, those of you that have young kids, I know the kids' classes get out at 11:15. I'm going to go a little past that. But at 11:15, I'm going to stop. If you have young kids, could you go grab them? Because I don't want them to have to just sit there and wait. It's hard on the teachers when they kind of have to babysit. I don't mean that pejoratively, but I just mean they're just waiting for us to get out. So if you have young kids, just do that at 11:15 and give those teachers a break who are dealing with the young kids there. Look at Daniel 2. And there's much I'd love to discuss in this passage, but you may recall that in Daniel 2, it's the chapter where King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon has a dream, and Daniel interprets it for him. And he has that dream of the statue that represents different kingdoms of the earth. There's the statue is gold, and then silver, and then bronze, and then the feet are iron mixed with clay. And Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, what you've seen is a representation of 4 kingdoms of the earth. And Nebuchadnezzar sees in that dream a stone that's cut from a mountain that wasn't cut with human hands, but it's just cut from the mountain, and it comes and it smashes the statue. And here is what Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar about what this dream means. And as we read it, I want you to think again of this question, what is God promising here? What's God promising in Daniel 2? Daniel 2, and we're just going to look at verses 44 to 45. And in the days of those kings, that is, the kings represented by the feet made of iron mixed with clay, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. We'll just stop there. What is God promising here in Daniel chapter 2? Well, it's very similar to what he promised in Isaiah 40. He's promising to bring his kingdom to earth. That's what Daniel 2 is all about. He's promising to bring his kingdom to earth. And I want you to think of this in parallel to what we saw in Isaiah 40. Remember, Isaiah 40, the good news is that Yahweh is coming to reign as king. Well, Daniel 2 is about the same thing. It's about the God of heaven establishing his reign and kingly authority in the earth universally. And it will destroy all the false kingdoms of the earth that stand against him. And I want you to note in Daniel 2:44, I want you to just keep in mind how Daniel refers to God, because this is going to be very important for how we understand kingdom of heaven in Matthew's gospel. In Daniel 2:44, he calls God the God of heaven. The God of heaven. Just keep that in mind. Now, flip over a few pages to Daniel 7. Daniel 7. And again, what is God promising here in Daniel 7? Well, it's the same overall point, but with a very different detail that's given. Look at Daniel 7. Daniel here is seeing a vision. And by the way, it's 11:15, so if you do have young kids, just step out. Know that these classes are recorded, so anything that you miss, you can always go back and watch the recording online if you miss anything. I'll just be a few more minutes. In Daniel 7, look at what Daniel sees in his vision. Starting in verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. What we see here in Daniel 7 is the same big picture point of Daniel 2. God is going to bring his kingdom to earth. But in Daniel 7, we get this extra detail that God is going to rule through one like a son of man. God is promising to rule through one like a son of man. We saw the same idea in Ezekiel 37. Because remember, in Ezekiel 37, God promises to reign through who? Through David, through a Davidic king. Well, same general point here. God is going to rule through one like a son of man, but notice that this son of man is described in ways that seem to make him more than human. He's coming on the clouds of heaven, which is always used of God in the Old Testament. He's presented before God, and he's given an eternal kingdom, and he's given all authority. Well, I thought those things belonged to God. Well, yes, they do. And yet God is going to then manifest those things through this one like a son of man. And then finally, one more point from Daniel 7 that's very important. God is promising to give an everlasting kingdom to this son of man for all peoples and nations. Now, would you do this for me in your book? I want to change how that point is worded. On the screen, I have it as an everlasting kingdom for all peoples and nations. Well, in your book, it says of. Would you change that for me? And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But just in your book, change that so that it reflects what I have on the screen. An everlasting kingdom for all peoples and nations. It's not that how I originally worded it is false, but I do want us to avoid a common misunderstanding. Were you taught when you were growing up, I remember explicitly being taught this, that in Daniel, especially Daniel 2, the kingdom is the church. That's what Daniel 2 is about. I was taught that the kingdom is the church. And brethren, I would submit to you that is not correct. The kingdom is not synonymous with the church, the community of God's people. They are a result of God's kingship. The point of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Isaiah, and all these passages about kingdom is that God is bringing His kingship, His royal authority to earth. Now that will result in a people, yes, but we cannot use those two terms interchangeably as if they're the same thing. So kingdom is a separate concept from the people of the kingdom. They are related, yes, but they're not the same. And I want to make sure that we avoid that misunderstanding. You'll hear me bring that up again later when we talk about this phrase, kingdom of heaven, in Matthew's gospel. So that's why I just wanted it to be clear that it's an everlasting kingdom for all peoples and nations, just to make that distinction, just so we don't equate those two as if they're the same thing. Now, our last passage I've already given you in the book. We're not going to turn to it because I'm going to have it on the screen. But real quickly, let me say it, and then we're going to wrap up here. It's very fitting that in Daniel 7, God says, I'm going to give all authority to this Son of Man, and then He's going to have this kingdom that will consist of peoples from all nations of the earth. Because do you remember what God had said at the very beginning of the biblical story to Abram? When He said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and he who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, Abram, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Remember that God's original plan, or not original, that God's plan is that He would restore His blessing to all humans through the seed of Abraham. That's how God's going to do it. And so in Daniel 7, when we read of this kingdom that consists of all peoples, it's just reminding us of God's worldwide scope. He's got the whole world in His view, not just one particular people. A particular people will be His instrument of blessing, but His scope is all nations. Now, let's just wrap this up. What we've seen in the Old Testament is that God is promising these things. Obviously, this is very selective, but these are the things we've seen this morning. God has promised to exercise His kingship. We saw that in Isaiah 40, as well as in Daniel 2 and 7. We saw that God promised to rule through a Davidic king, which is what He promised in Ezekiel 37. We saw that God promised to bring His kingship to earth through a Son of Man, And then finally, we saw that God had promised to bless all nations through Abraham. Now, with these things in mind, let me close today by connecting these to things that Matthew's going to say in his gospel, so that I hope the light bulb goes off for you and you're thinking, oh, I see what Matthew is saying. Go back to Matthew 1:1. Go back to Matthew 1:1. Do you see then the richness? A line that we probably would just read over and not give it a second thought, but do you see the richness in one sentence that Matthew provides for us in the opening of his gospel? The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, that is the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I'm about to tell you the story of God's anointed Davidic king, and I'm about to tell you the story of God bringing to fruition His plan to bless all nations of the earth through an offspring of Abraham. That's the story you're about to read in Matthew's gospel. Flip over a page or two to Matthew 3. Look at Matthew 3. And keep in mind what we saw in Daniel. And now put these words in their Old Testament context. Matthew 3, verses 1 through 3. In those days, John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. For this is he who was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah, when Isaiah said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Do you see the shockwave that John's preaching would have sent through the Jewish world when John comes on the scene and says, the kingship of heaven, the reign of God in heaven is at hand? Just what we saw promised in Daniel. What God had promised in Daniel is about to happen. And this is how Matthew summarizes Jesus' own preaching in Matthew 4:17. Just flip over one more page. If someone were to ask you, what is Jesus' preaching all about? Matthew gives you his answer in Matthew 4:17. From that time, Jesus began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The very thing that God had promised to bring His rulership to earth, the God of heaven is bringing His kingdom to earth. The difference between John and Jesus is that John said that kingdom of heaven is coming in a future figure. Jesus is going to make it clear it's coming through Him, through His ministry. And do you remember how Jesus refers to Himself in Matthew's gospel? Frequently. Remember Jesus' designation for Himself? Mr. Jim, what'd you say? Wait, he doesn't refer to Himself as Son of God, but He does refer to Himself as Son of Man. Daniel 7. In fact, it is Jesus' reference to that passage and applying it to Himself. That is what's going to convince the Jewish leaders to crucify Him as a blasphemer. And yet throughout His ministry, when He says Son of Man, you know what He's implying from that Daniel 7 background, that He is the ruler. And then finally, one more. Would you look at Matthew 4:23? We'll close with this. This is what Matthew's gospel is all about. And Jesus went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. The good news of the kingdom. That is what Matthew is telling us. God had promised in the Old Testament to bring His kingship to earth, His reign to earth, and Matthew is telling us it is happening in this Nazarene, this man Jesus. That is what Jesus' preaching and message was all about. Now, let's just wrap this up. If you look at the next page in your book, may I just close with these words that I've written just to show how we're setting the stage. Look at look at page 5 in your book. This is how these passages set the stage for Matthew's gospel so that we can understand it in context. Matthew's gospel is not a story told in isolation, but is the climax to the story of creation contained in the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. The good news that Matthew is sharing is that the reign of God that was promised in Isaiah has begun to take effect through the person of Jesus. That God's kingdom that was promised in Daniel has come to earth and has shattered the dark forces that stand behind earthly kingdoms. And that the Davidic throne is now occupied by God's anointed king who will shepherd God's people into the new creation. The Gospel of Matthew is Matthew's version of how God has fulfilled and continues to fulfill all his cosmic purposes recorded in Scripture. It is imperative, therefore, that we read Matthew's Gospel in the context of the Hebrew Scriptures, which Matthew claims are fulfilled in a lowly man from an inconsequential town called Nazareth. What this means for human beings, both the wonder and the warning, will be revealed as Matthew's narrative progresses. What will also be revealed is that God's kingdom has come in unexpected ways, and this will challenge not only the people of the first century, but us as well. And we'll see some of those challenges as we read this narrative together. Would you do this week? I'm going to give you some homework. Read or listen to Matthew's gospel all the way through. Even if you can't do it in one sitting, do it in several large sittings. But get familiar with the overall story so that when we look at individual scenes and portions, you'll have the larger story context in your mind. Do that this week, and I promise you, you will start seeing things yourself in Matthew's gospel that you never saw before, because you're reading it or listening to it as a holistic narrative. Do that this week, and then next Sunday we'll start with Matthew 1:1 to 1:17, and we'll look at that opening section. God be with you this week. Thank you for your kind attention today.